way democracies fall nowadays is usually not through a coup d'etat or some kind of military, event. I mean, they fall through because legitimately elected people who don't have respect for the institutions of the system take them apart. And would Trump do that if he can? I mean, yes, I think he would.
Anne Applebaum is a Pulitzer Prize-winning author and staff writer at The Atlantic. Her new book is Autocracy, Inc., Dictators Who Want to Run the World. She joins us now. Thanks for coming on the show, Anne.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to start with your recent piece in The Atlantic, which sparked a lot of buzz. And you could say it's something of a warning. The headline is, Trump is speaking like Hitler, Stalin, and Mussolini. Just to start, what compelled you to write this piece?
So the funny thing is, this piece to me seemed almost banal, because Trump has been using this language, which is a very specific language that comes from the 1930s. He's been doing it for a while, but it somehow it became more prominent and noticeable recently. And this is the language where he talks about his, the enemies within, the enemies of the people. And specifically, he talks about his political opponents and migrants also as vermin. He talks about migrants poisoning the blood of Americans. And this is language that it's not only comes from Hitler, it also comes from Stalin. And I wrote several books about Stalin and Stalinism. And just to jog my memory, I have a whole file of notes that I once took in the East German archives, or the Stasi archives. This is the archives of the East German secret police. And I typed the word vermin into the search line and discovered dozens of examples of the Stasi using it too. And it's not been part of American politics before. I mean, American politics have been racist before, and we've called one another traitors and unpatriotic and so on. We haven't talked about one another as being insects or vermin or parasites. And this comes from the language of regimes who saw their enemies as not citizens, as not necessarily human, as people who could be treated or destroyed any way that they liked. And all my piece it wasn't a very long piece. It just listed some of the things that Trump said and showed how that language had been used in the 1930s and 40s by others. But you're right, it caused some controversy because to people who are going to vote for Trump, this seems very offensive, and they alternatively wanted to dismiss it or deny it or say, but Biden and Harris are just as bad, even though, there's no evidence of that.
Yeah, so one of the probably the most prominent person who objected to the piece was Elon Musk, who obviously big Trump supporter these days. And he sort of mocked it as being, I guess, sensationalist would be his argument. What did you make of his response to it and the response more broadly?
So my piece is literally, it's almost a list. It's just citations.
Yeah.
And mocking it is one way to dismiss something that bothers you. I mean, I'm just quoting people. I didn't say Trump is Hitler. I didn't say Trump will cause a new Holocaust. And actually, what I think the danger of Trumpism is not some kind of Nazi, stormtrooper, some kind of scenes that you would recognize from movies about the Third Reich. I mean, I think the threat of Trumpism is something different. It's the threat of Trump assaulting and undermining institutions, which is how most democracies fail nowadays. They do so by slowly undermining judges, courts, bureaucrats. And so on. So so the piece wasn't saying he will be Hitler. The piece was just saying he's talking like Hitler, and it was also saying that he does so knowingly, and there's some evidence for that. He once said at one of his rallies, "I haven't read Mein Kampf." I mean, who randomly says I haven't read Mein Kampf? I mean, this is Hitler's famous sort of kind of anti-Semitic rant. You don't say that unless it's in the front of your brain. And so the explanation for it is that he's using this language because he thinks it will work. I mean, he thinks that it will appeal to some Americans, that it will create anger and division, which is what it did in Nazi Germany and in Stalin's Russia, by the way, and in communist East Germany. And it will give people the feeling that they're threatened by people or enemies who are something like illness or disease. And as I said, Musk's attitude is mock it, laugh at it, don't take it seriously. And that's one way of trying to ignore it or marginalize these quotations, they come from videos and tapes and rallies that we've all seen on television. So I didn't have to make anything up.
It ended up being very, very timely, the piece this week, because we had some new reporting from Jeffrey Goldberg, your editor at The Atlantic, who had comments from General John Kelly, who served as Trump's DHS secretary, his chief of staff, decorated four-star general. And he claimed that Trump said, among other things, "I need the kind of generals that Hitler had," and made the point that Trump, who previously had served as CEO of an organization in America, was upset that the generals and their pesky attitudes about respecting the law were getting in the way of what he wanted done. And the New York Times also reported that Trump had repeatedly praised Hitler in private and even said at one point that he did some good things. I should note the Trump campaign denied that he ever said this, but John Kelly is a man who is quite well regarded, served in Trump's administration, and it's unclear why he would make any of this up. What did you make of that reporting?
So first of all, John Kelly's been saying some of this off the record for a long time. So some of it I'd heard before. So it didn't surprise me. Also, I think it does reflect something about Trump's inclinations. Again, it's not that he's going to create a new Holocaust, but he does admire not just Hitler, but President Xi and President Putin. He admires people who rule without checks and balances, without the rule of law, without real legal opposition, people who have an absolutely unfettered ability to do whatever they want, which is, of course, the definition of an autocracy or a dictatorship. And that he would admire someone from history who's done that well seems completely unsurprising to me, because he says versions of this all the time. And this, of course, in his first term in office, he was saying the same kinds of things, but at that time he was hemmed in by people like John Kelly and others who understood how the American political system works, namely that in the American system, soldiers in the army and generals swear an oath to the Constitution, not of personal loyalty to the president. And employees of the federal government also work on behalf of the Constitution and not as personal. They're not sidekicks of the president in most positions. And Trump was never able to get used to that. He found it difficult to understand. And he repeatedly, if you look back at the history of that administration, the constant clashes with people he was working with people in the military, it was always over that. So I'm not surprised at all. He also seems to know almost no history. Actually, Hitler's generals famously organized a plot to try and kill him. So I mean, wishing for Hitler's generals, if you think that means you're wishing for a super loyal military, is also amazingly mistaken. But it seems to be a piece of his idée fixe is the idea of absolute power and absolute control. And that seems to be what he wants. And so, that whether he's talking about his enemies as viruses who don't have to have any rights or any consideration, or whether he's talking about admiring Hitler, I mean, they seem to be part of the same aspect of his personality.
So just to talk about Trump's defense for a brief second, you're getting at this a little bit. There's a disconnect between what you're arguing, which is that in this piece that you wrote for The Atlantic and in Trump's latest, that he's not actually going to behave necessarily like Hitler or Mussolini would or Stalin would.
He won't be able to, at least not immediately. Yeah.
Right. And so whereas his defenders, like Elon Musk, let's say, will look at these kinds of arguments and look at what John Kelly says and dismiss it as ridiculous and absurd. We already had Trump in power once. He didn't commit a Holocaust, so why is everyone pretending that he's like Hitler? Whereas your argument is a little bit more nuanced, or a lot more nuanced than that, which is that he is using this kind of rhetoric because it excites people, in the same way that Hitler used that kind of rhetoric because it excites people, and that he also would operate as president in ways that mimics strongmen, and because he has an appreciation for dictators, it doesn't necessarily mean that he would act like a dictator. To get to the concrete,
although I should say, I mean, the way democracies fall nowadays is usually not through a coup d'état or some kind of military, event. I mean, they fall through because legitimately elected people who don't have respect for the institutions of the system take them apart. And would Trump do that if he can? I mean, yes, I think he would. And will he be surrounded in his second term by people who want to do that and will help him do that? Yes, I think it's very possible. I mean, J.D. Vance has said openly things that sound very similar. Project 2025, produced by the Heritage Foundation, which has lots of people who either were served with him or close to him, contributed to it, is exactly that project.
Yeah.
So I'm adding an element of nuance, but that doesn't mean that, that you can dismiss it all or say, oh, it's a joke, or say, but Joe Biden told people to get vaccinated, which is what somebody said to me, and that's equally bad. I mean, there is something that he's saying to us, and he's warning us, and he's hoping it will help him win, and we should take it seriously.
What do you think we would have in store if Trump does win in 2 weeks?
So, Trump's very hard to predict because his real only interest is himself. So he doesn't have an ideology of power in the way that some people do. He has one or two policy issues that he cares about. One of them is he wants high tariffs, and the other is he wants to leave NATO. And those are two things he's been saying for 30 years. Beyond that, he doesn't know much, he doesn't care much. But as I said, what he wants is this feeling of absolute power and control. And so the danger of Trump in his second term is that he would employ people who would seek to achieve that agenda. Who would, for example, fire civil servants who are competent and have meritocratic qualities or reasons to be doing their jobs, and replace them with absolute loyalists who will just do whatever is said. There's a real threat of corruption. I mean, his first term was very corrupt. Many of these were stories that weren't often reported. The Ministry of Agriculture and Ministry of Energy was stuffed full of former lobbyists who were using their jobs in the government as ways of making money, and that would be on steroids, that kind of practice. So the further corruption of the federal government, the creation of loyalists, possibly the use of the Department of Justice to go after people, to go after his, the enemies within. I mean, the political enemies who he thinks don't have rights. Possibly the use of other federal institutions. He's actually talked about the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission. He's talked about using it against television stations. So that's a possibility. It's happened in the past in American history that presidents have tried to use the IRS to harass people, and that's a tactic used in other autocratic countries. It was widely used in Russia in the 2000s. It's what the Hungarians do. It's what the Polish government that was in charge for 8 years, used financial investigations and harassment to undermine people. I mean, you would begin to see a lot of stuff like that would be. Might have some precedence in American history, but the scale of it would feel, particularly right now at this moment in time, would feel very weird. And so that's all very possible. I mean, the stuff that he says about mass deportation and creating, building camps to put migrants in, it's very hard to know how that would work. He would need a lot of people enabling him to do that. It's not something that could happen right away. But you would be surprised, and here I say as somebody I lived part of the time in Poland and I watched this happen, you'd be surprised how fast some things could change. I mean, the Department of Justice could change its spots overnight. The FCC or the IRS could change very quickly with the right kinds of people in charge. And maybe then over time he would seek to create these kind of displays of violence and control, which is also what some of the people following him admire about him, and what he, these are things that he finds satisfying. Again, he likes the idea just as other authoritarians do, of demonstrating and showing his power. Remember, he wanted to shoot at demonstrators during the George Floyd protests. He wants to show that he's in control. He wants military parades. This is the kind of this is what satisfies him. And I think there would be a lot of that. Some of it might be, some of it might not matter, and some of it might matter terribly. And we would begin to have a shift to a very different kind of political culture in Washington.
I think it's easy to forget that during his first term, there was a story in the New York Times, the Washington Post, almost weekly, that Trump had proposed something that we would consider quite extreme, and that somebody in his administration stopped him from doing it. And he had all these pretty strong conservatives in administration: Jeff Sessions, Jim Mattis, John Kelly. And very often they rejected some of his more outlandish ideas. And you're right that what we know about the incoming administration, should he win the election, is that a lot of those figures would not be in power anymore, and that a lot of his worst impulses would probably be enabled.
Yeah, so I made a podcast, a 5-part podcast called Autocracy in America, that describes some of this in greater detail, exactly these kinds of processes. And one of the people we interviewed was John Bolton, who was his national security advisor. And Bolton told us the story, my colleague and I, of being in a car and driving with Trump to a European summit. And Trump turns to Bolton. He says, "Today's the day we're going to make history, John. We're going to leave NATO." And John and Bolton and Mattis and all kinds of other people, started putting pressure on him, said, "Don't do it. It'll have they convinced him, I think, that it would be bad for him politically. But will those people be there a second time? Probably not. You would have, with Vance and with, and with Trump's, with Don Jr. having positions of power and influence. I mean, you would see very different kinds of people in the White House. So yes, you would have to worry a lot more about this stuff than we did previously."
Now, your book, Autocracy, Inc., it notes that a lot of these autocrats don't do it alone. You write that autocracies are not run by one bad guy, but by sophisticated networks relying on kleptocratic financial structures. And you speak about a number of cases throughout your book, but one of the things that I was thinking about, especially this week, with the way that Elon Musk has inserted himself into this election campaign, there seems to be an effort on his part that reminded me a lot of what you write in the book, to use his wealth to really influence this campaign in a way that may or may not be legal. What do you make of his role in this election and his support for Trump?
So Musk clearly has an ambition to be an oligarch. And a Russian-style oligarch is somebody whose wealth and money and power are not, it's not just that he has a good relationship with the people who run the country, they mesh and they intermingle. And so the oligarch is enriched by the politicians. The politicians then sometimes, in Russia, I mean, they're often the same people. I mean, the politicians own the major companies, or have investments in them. And Musk playing this role, and playing it in the run up to the election, is also something that's pretty unprecedented in U.S. politics. I mean, there's a lot of money in U.S. politics. And I mean, there's almost no other democracy on the planet that runs elections like ours, which are as saturated with money as these are. But using it openly to appear to buy votes, to offer $1 million rewards to people who register to vote. And this is the scale of things matter too. It's not just. It's the offering $1 million to random people isn't something that we've ever had before in an American election campaign. I have to say, I've just come back from Germany, where I was for several days, and I have to tell you, Europeans keep asking me, how is this legal? They can't imagine how you could have, somebody playing that kind of role in the political system. But Musk's interest appears to be a business interest, a financial interest, as well as his own interest in power and in having, being able to operate, for example, without regulation. He has an enormous number of businesses that have conflicts with it. He has deals with the U.S. government, but a lot of them are also in conflict in various ways. There are environmental issues or there are regulatory issues, and perhaps he thinks that by having a kind of symbiotic relationship with Trump, that he would eliminate all of his problems with regulation. But this is a really dangerous precedent, and it would change very much, I think, the way the relationship between business and politics in the country. I mean, it's not good as it is, but this would make it worse.
I want to talk just quickly about election night. You wrote in a recent story that we can be absolutely certain that an attempt will be made to steal the 2024 election if Kamala Harris wins.
Of course.
What worries you most about election night, or election week, I should say, because this is probably going to take longer than just the night, given last time and what we're in store for?
So, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that whatever happens, by 11 o'clock that evening, Trump will declare victory. I mean, that's what happened last time.
Yep.
So unless, of course, it's a landslide for Harris, but if it's close in any way, he will declare victory, and then he will put into motion, various projects to make sure that perhaps to slow down the count as he did before, if he thinks he's behind, in order to enable various schemes to unflow. I mean, I think it'll be in that sense similar to what happened in 2020, except that this time it'll be on a larger scale. And of course, this time we're better prepared for it as well. But it will be on a larger scale. There are already lawsuits being teed up. Challenges to voter registration are already being made in a number of swing states. There are already some precedents of counties, particular counties refusing to certify electoral results. There are also, I should say, there are lawyers on the other side who are suing those kinds of counties. I mean, so there's already the legal battle is already unfolding. It's already started. And the attempt to change the perception of the election will begin almost as soon as the polls close, if not before. I mean, in a way, it's begun now. It's very interesting that this betting market, this very strange betting market statistics that have been shown. Maybe you've seen them or run across them in your reading in the last few days. There's a betting market that's at least partially owned by Peter Thiel, which has been showing these huge margins of victory for Republicans, like 60% to 40% and so on. And that kind of thing is also part of an attempt in advance to show that the Republicans are winning and they're going to win, so that, as I said, in case it's close or in case Harris wins, they will challenge the
right.
The
Trump
result.
couldn't have possibly lost this election because of
given how far he was ahead in this betting market,
right.
He couldn't have possibly lost the election. And remember, a betting market is easily manipulated by money. I mean, it's just whoever puts money on it decides who. It's not a poll. It's market. So
right.
So there are these, there's a lot of what so-called red wave polls out there that are also, seeking to favor Trump as much as possible to give the impression that he's winning. I mean, that's not to say that he won't win. I mean, he might win, but right now they're doing what they can to prepare in advance, just in case he doesn't win, so that they can challenge the result.
Piece of yours that's been getting a lot of attention in light of your new book and the war in the Middle East. Back in 2002, you wrote a piece for Slate, and the headline was "Kill the Messenger." And in it, you argued that official Palestinian radio and TV studios are fair targets in the war between Israel and Palestine. And you wrote that these media organizations qualified as combatants and were therefore legitimate military targets. You've been getting some criticism online for that piece recently.
First of all, that was 22 years ago. Mm-hmm. Second of all, I don't write the headlines, okay? And I still don't write the headlines. In fact, I had a problem with that this week. Second of all, I don't have the piece in front of me now, but most of it was speculative. It was about, should we consider them combatants in the war? Not we should kill them. So It wasn't about, it wasn't advocating murder or whatever the headline said.
Okay.
And also, I think, after 22 years, I'm allowed to not remember what was the context that I was writing it in.
Sure. But have your views changed on that, on that idea that any media outlets, whether or not they're a member of a state or not, should be considered combatants?
Obviously, I don't think media outlets should be killed. No, I mean, I don't think journalists should be killed, or that media outlets are considered combatants. I mean, there is a complicated question about what propagandists are. The Russian propagandists who support the war in Ukraine, no, I don't think they're military targets, but should they be the targets of sanctions? Yes, they should.
Anne Applebaum, thanks so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
After our interview, a spokesperson for Anne Applebaum sent us an amended statement from her about her 2002 Slate article. The statement from Anne Applebaum reads, "Although I recently saw a screenshot of that article on X, which I ignored, I hadn't read it for more than 2 decades and was not prepared to be asked about it. Now that I have, I can say that it could have been better worded, and the headline, which I would not have written, could have been less provocative. But the substance of the article, which was mostly about the dehumanizing propaganda being taught to Palestinian children, is still consistent with everything else I write. 22 years later, I'm still against teaching children, whether Palestinian or Israeli, to hate each other. I still think propagandists bear co-responsibility for war. And of course, I did not believe then and do not believe now that radio stations or television stations are actually legitimate military targets." Thank you for watching this episode of Press Club. Please tune in next week. We've got a special election episode in anticipation for the 2024 presidential race. We'll see you next week.